Moving on now to talk about Mikhail. He has a master's degree in religious studies and a doctorate in the philosophy of religion from Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He still lives in the Philadelphia area. He's written quite a few articles on the history of religion, philosophy, and contemporary art. They've been published in Russian and American scholarly journals. He's the author or editor of 9 books, including Theory of Religious Cycles, Tradition, Modernity, and the Baha'i Faith, which of course is his topic today. That book was published by Brill a few years ago. He teaches history of religions and philosophy and modern art at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. He's also co-chair of the Wilmot Institute's Department of Religion, Philosophy, and Theology, with Mujan Momen being that's right, that particular department. And teaches our courses on philosophy and theology as well. So it's been really quite exciting to have him involved in the Wilmot Institute. He's also been able to invite Leonard Swidler, a well-known Catholic theologian of interfaith dialogue, to speak on this web series in the past with him and myself. And we're looking forward to 2 more presentations in 2020, one of which will be with a philosopher he is hoping to contact and one of which he'll be offering himself. So with that very long introduction, Mikhail, welcome very much. Thank you for coming to this web talk today, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
My talk is about my book, which has the same title, Theory of Religious Cycles, Tradition, Modernity, and the Baha'i Faith. And the central question of my book is not only scholarly, but also existential for me. The question is, how was the Soviet Union possible? How was the Soviet experience possible? I lived the first 30 years of my life in the Soviet Union, so I was raised in the Soviet Union. And actually, I belong to the 3rd generation of Soviet people. I think our generation is quite unique because we are the only generation in all of human history that were raised without any religious tradition whatsoever. What was the Soviet experience? The Soviet experience was, of course, tragic, but it was also a long-lasting social experiment. I think in order to move forward in post-Soviet Russia, Russians need an existential closure, a clear comprehension of the origin and meaning of Russian communism. Theodor Adorno once noted, in reference to the Holocaust, that, I quote, "To write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric." And this quote became quite famous. Many philosophers now say that poetry after the Holocaust is impossible. So if we apply the same principle, the same approach to the Soviet Union, we may also say, is philosophy that is not barbaric possible after the Gulag? So what was the Soviet Union? First of all, it was a unique empire in world history. It was a totalitarian political state. It was run by planned state economy and militant atheist ideology. Religious movements were suppressed and their followers persecuted. You know, I'm giving you this brief information because I do not know what is the age of those who are listening, and my students who are very young actually have no idea of what the Soviet Union was about. They think that Soviet Union was somewhere in the Middle Ages, and now I know that I have to cover some of the basics. So the USSR survived for 75 years. In the second half of the 20th century, it was joined by other communist regimes in Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Some of them are still surviving and posing a significant danger to the world, China and North Korea. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, 4 main trends of thought arose in Russia to offer new ideological directions for the country. And this is post-Soviet Marxism, Orthodox Christian philosophy, postmodernism, and globalism. Each of those 4 trends is trying to offer its own specific explanation for the rise and fall of Soviet communism. For example, Marxists who actually survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the contemporary Communist Party in Russia is quite powerful, not as powerful, of course, as Putin and his party, but still, it is one of the party in opposition. Pocket opposition, maybe, but still. So Marxists tend to focus on the positive aspects of Soviet history, the fight for economic and social justice for the people of labor. Nationalist orthodoxy views communism as a foreign ideology, a social disease that Russia contracted from the decaying Western culture. So orthodox nationalist thinkers are usually contrasting Russian culture that is based on Orthodox Christianity with the Western culture that is based on the Western types of Christianity, Catholicism and later Protestantism. Postmodernists interpret the Soviet experiment as the last totalitarian empire with the so-called grand narrative. And postmodernists are against all kinds of narratives. They are also against all kinds of truth. And they are against the truth with the capital T. Postmodernism is one of the popular intellectual currents in contemporary Russia. Finally, globalists understand the Soviet project as one of the phases in the process of globalization that will eventually lead to the planetary system of government. Now, my own understanding of the Soviet Union and of the origin and meaning of Russian communism does not fit neatly into any of those four approaches. I developed my own theory, and maybe this theory does not fit into any other views because of my personal experience. In the end of 1990, I came to the United States to study at Temple University. I came to study religion, and in terms of religious studies, I was really a blank slate. My tabula was very rasa. So for me, it was the study of religion from scratch in the United States after my Soviet atheist experience. And maybe because of this juxtaposition, I developed a theory that I would like to present to you now. Now, I have to say that in modern times, there have been numerous attempts by scholars to theorize about religion. In the 19th century, Western thought produced major theories on the subject, which are still debated in American universities as classical illustrations of scholarly work in the field. So we are talking about Emil Durkheim, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud. We are talking about Robert Bellah in the United States and some others. Most of those theories, however, tend to reduce the content of religion to other areas of human activity. So Marx, as it is well known, reduced religion to economics, Freud to psychology, Durkheim to sociology. There were some thinkers who were not reductionist, for example, Carl Gustav Jung, but still, most of the theories were trying to understand religion not from the religious point of view. Now, my theory of religious cycles does not aim to discover the essence of religion or to reduce it to other forms of social activity. I would say that what I'm doing is phenomenology of religion. And from this perspective, any religious system is primarily a semantic structure that creates a net of meanings whose origin is not available to ordinary human beings. In my study, I abstain, therefore, from truth claims, since they are not a priori verifiable, but instead concentrate on the evolutionary development of religious systems. As I said, phenomenology of religion. That is my main concern. So, inasmuch as religion generates a semantic field, its most important task is to preserve the true meaning of its original teachings. Because those teachings are not available to ordinary humans, they usually come from the founders. The founders are special human beings in different religions. They are called by different names, but the idea behind this is still the same, whether it is the Buddha or the Tirthankara in Jainism or the Avatar in Hinduism or the Prophet in Judaism or the manifestation of God in Baha'i Faith or the messenger of God in Islam, etc. Those human beings are special, and therefore they deliver some special knowledge. So the most important task of religion is to preserve the true meaning of this special knowledge. These sacred scriptures hold the absolute authority within the community of believers, but they are also complemented by the sacred tradition, whose main purpose is to interpret the primary texts. Both sacred scriptures and sacred tradition constitute the backbone of any religious system whose development depends on the proper interaction between the two components. Obviously, in my analysis of religions, I rely on the so-called historical religions, religions that have been created after the invention of writing. There are religions that have been created before the invention of writing, but it is impossible to trace their development because that was an oral tradition. So that was an oral tradition, and it is very difficult to trace the origin and the development, the evolution of oral traditions. So in my analysis, I focus on four major world religions: Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. In the course of its evolution and independently of its doctrines and practices, a religious system goes through a certain number of stages or phases, which I call early or formative, orthodox, classical, reformist, critical, and post-critical. Now, let me talk more in detail about each phase. So the early or formative phase contributes to the formation of the scriptural canon and the establishment of the sacred tradition of a given religion. The orthodox phase cements these traditional foundations, and they are fighting heretical movements and their alternative spiritual interpretations. The classical phase reformulates the sacred tradition by adding new interpretations to the canon. Reformists purify tradition from the accumulated interpretations in order to get back to the core of sacred teachings and restore the original faith. And finally, in post-critical phase, religions renew their foundation again by reorganizing their sacred tradition and restoring the authority of primary scriptures. Now, this may sound quite abstract, but we will come to the chart that will present it in more clear terms. Okay. So next, let's talk about the two types of crises that religion can go through. In the course of its evolution, each religion seems to go through two types of crises, structural and systemic. Structural crises which challenge sacred tradition are usually resolved by the appearance of new branches or divisions within the existing religions. So that's, for example, how Catholicism came to be when Catholicism and Orthodoxy separated from each other. That's how Protestantism started as an alternative sacred tradition, an alternative to Catholicism sacred tradition. The same happened in all religions. In contrast to structural crises that question tradition, systemic crisis of religion shakes up the foundation of the system itself, namely its sacred scriptures. Systemic crisis marks a fundamental challenge to religious authority that can be overcome only by the introduction of new religious systems with their own scriptural texts. So that's what was happening with Buddhism and Jainism when they were conceived, created, started in the midst of Hinduism. That's what was happening with Christianity. That was started in the midst of Judaism. During this critical phase, mother religions usually produce their offshoots in the form of new religious movements. So, and here we come to a chart that shows us the structure of this model of religious cycle. So here we have, for example, the beginning of religion, the systemic crisis of mother religion and reform that is expressing itself in the birth of new religious movements. Then these movements go through their formative stage or formative phase when they create their scriptural canon, establish their rituals, establish their system of authority and scriptures, rituals, authority, and I think I'm forgetting something else, but they establish their own foundations. The next phase, the orthodox phase, cements the tradition of interpretation of the scriptural texts. And then a religion evolves through different phases, classical, reformist, and finally it comes down to the systemic crisis. The systemic crisis of a religion, which marks its critical phase, means that the authority of the sacred scriptures, not just sacred tradition, are in question. And as a result, new religions start, and the mother religion adapts, adjusts to these new religious movements by going into its post-critical phase. So here is an example of this cycle when it is applied to Judaism. And Judaism serves as an archetype, a basic archetype of the evolution of religion. Of course, this was reconstructed through the Bible and the biblical data. We are talking about biblical Judaism. We are not sure about the exact centuries, but these are the centuries that scholars came up with. So the cycle begins somewhere in the 13th century with the revelation of Moses, and it goes through its formative phase, the conquest of Canaan. Then when Joshua settles on the promised land, the Jews are organizing the tribal society that was ruled by the judges. So this corresponds to the Orthodox phase. Then King David unites all the tribes of Israel into a kingdom. So the period of monarchy, united and then divided, corresponds to the classical phase. And then after the Babylonian captivity, the Jews are allowed by the Persians in this time, the Jews are allowed to come back to their promised land and revitalize their religious life. It was back then, around the 5th, 4th century, that priests, Jewish priests, according to biblical scholars, edit and finalize the Torah. So post-exilic Judaism serves as an example of a reformed tradition. The priests want to come back to the foundation of Judaism, to the law of Moses. And finally, around the times of Jesus, Judaism is going through its systemic crisis, which results in the beginning and development of Christianity. What was the Jewish response to the development of Christianity? Rabbinic Judaism or Talmudic Judaism. So Rabbinic or Talmudic Judaism is an example of a post-critical phase of this religion. Now let's briefly discuss the same cycles, but when they applied to other religions. First one, Buddhism. So Buddha started his religion around the 6th, 5th century BC. And here we have the same trajectory. First, the Buddhist councils and the establishment of the core teaching of Buddhism. In this first formative phase, we see some splinter groups, Pugdalavada and Sarvastivada, which did exist for quite a while, but are extinct now. Then Theravada Buddhism, or the tradition of the elders, corresponds to the Orthodox phase. Theravada Buddhism is now present in Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos. Mahayana Buddhism corresponds to the classical phase. Mahayana Buddhism was one of the main religions of China and is one of the main religions in Japan. Then Vajrayana Buddhism, in my analysis, corresponds to the reformist phase. Let me say a couple of words about Vajrayana. Now, Vajrayana means the diamond vehicle, in contrast to Mahayana, which is the greater vehicle, and Hinayana. That's how Mahayana Buddhists call Theravada. Hinayana means the lesser vehicle towards salvation. So if you ask Vajrayana monks, they will tell you that they are part of Mahayana. Tibetan Buddhism is part of Mahayana, and that's how it usually portrayed in textbooks. However, I consider it as a different phase within the development of Buddhism for various reasons. The first reason is that Vajrayana has a name that juxtaposes it not simply to one of the sects within Mahayana, like Zen or Pure Land, but it juxtaposes it to the names of two other branches of religion. Number two, Vajrayana sees itself as the culmination and the ultimate phase of the development of Buddhism. Number three, Vajrayana scriptures include Theravada and Mahayana scriptures, but they also add their own scriptures that they consider to be the most important, the most vital in Buddhist practice. Four, Vajrayana Buddhism developed its own specific religious practices connected to Tantra and Tantra Yoga. And five, Vajrayana Buddhism is the only form of Buddhism that practiced a form of theocracy when Dalai Lama, the main leader of Tibetan Buddhists, was considered not also a religious leader but also a political leader of the Buddhist community. Nowadays, of course, he rejected this claim. He wants Tibet, even if Tibet is still part of China, he wants Tibet to be autonomous culturally and religiously, and he realizes that if he continues his political claim, that will never happen. So he basically said that he's okay not to be the political leader as long as the persecution of Tibetan Buddhists in Tibet will stop. Now to Christianity. Christianity represents, I would say, the classical example of the religious cycle. It begins with Jesus Christ. It begins with Jesus Christ, goes through the early church, the first 4 centuries, by the way. It is so usually happens with historical religions that the first formative stage usually takes about 4 centuries, both in Christianity and in Buddhism, even maybe a little bit more. So we may say that this may be a tendency that may continue in the future. Then, after the early church, after Christianity was consolidated, became the state religion of the Roman Empire, canonized the Bible, established its organization, we see the beginning of its Orthodox phase, Orthodox Christianity, that later would separate itself from Catholicism. Now, the formative phase of Christianity corresponds to the so-called Oriental Orthodoxy, pre-Orthodox Orthodoxy, that is still surviving in Armenia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. The Orthodox phase of Christianity is Eastern Orthodoxy, which is now flourishing in Greece, Russia, and Eastern Europe. The classical phase is, of course, Catholicism. It is Europe, Canada, and Latin America. Reformist phase is Protestantism, Germany, England, Scandinavia, and America. And the critical phase of Christianity, and we are going to talk more about this critical phase, corresponds to what I would call deism. We will talk more about this later, and Unitarian Universalist Church, Europe and USA. Post-critical phase, in my view, in Christianity is represented by new Christian-like religious movements, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, we may debate whether they are part of Christianity or not, but they most surely see themselves as part of Christianity. So this is USA, Europe, and Latin America. My last example comes from Islam. So we see the same pattern, the same cycle, the same phases. Begins with the Prophet Muhammad and the four righteous caliphs, the so-called normative phase of Islam. By the way, the Kharijite Islam is still surviving in North Africa, in North Oman, and this form of Islam corresponds to the formative phase. Then the Orthodox and the the Orthodox and the classical phases here relate to Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. So Shia Islam, Iran, Iraq, and Bahrain, Sunni Islam, Indonesia, Africa, and Middle East. By the way, I'm teaching now a course on Asian religions, and I realized that Islam now became an Asian religion. The country with the most Muslim population is Indonesia. So reformist phase, in my theory, would be occupied by Wahhabism. And here I have to make, again, certain clarifications, because in scholarly literature, scholars of Islam usually talk about Shia and Sunni, and that's it. So why Wahhabism? And why would I say that Wahhabism corresponds to the critical phase? Let me pause for a moment. So Wahhabism is a faction within Islam, which historically speaking is relatively new, but it may still exemplify a reformist stage of the Muslim faith. At least I'm taking it as a reformist stage in the Muslim faith for my reasons. So I am referring to Wahhabism, a movement that was founded in the 18th century by Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. And this movement since then has served as a model for other versions of Muslim revivalism. Now, what is Muslim revivalism and how Muslim revivalism is different from Muslim modernism? The difference between Wahhabi revivalism and later Islamic modernism runs parallel to the difference between the Lutheran Reformation in Christianity and the following European Enlightenment in Christianity. Wahhabism closely followed the spirit of the Protestant Reformation, of course in Islam, but applied it in accordance with the theological doctrines and historical practice of the Muslim faith. That is why, in practical terms, I discuss it as the third branch of Islam. The self-proclaimed goal of Wahhabism still consists, of stripping Islam of all innovations, which had been accumulating over the centuries in Muslim tradition, and which Wahhabi supporters considered as deviations from true faith. So the purification of Islam, Wahhabis argued, was necessary in order to return to the straight path of the Muslim faith that was drawn by Muhammad and his early followers. Very similar to Martin Luther, who proposed a return to Christian origins and to the Bible. Al-Wahhab promoted a similar vision of Islam that is renewed by the example of the Prophet and the Sunni. Well, the practical implications of this return were different simply because the beginning of both religions, Christianity and Islam, were different. But the idea, the plan, was still the same. So now let's look at the comparative table of those religious cycles. So if you see here, this is the Buddhist cycle, this is the Muslim cycle, and this is the Christian cycle, you will see that in all three cases we have a complete, what is the right word? complete equation. It is pretty much the same if you look at modernity here, here, and here. So modernity begins in the 18th century Christianity, and it extends to Buddhism and to Islam. So we may say that 19th and 20th century are witnessing the extension and expansion of modernity to other religions. So let us discuss more in detail that particular period in human history, which coincides in all religions, modernity. Modern times, or modernity, begins with the European Enlightenment. But what is enlightenment? That is actually one of the main questions in modern philosophy, in all of modern philosophy, since Kant and up to Foucault. The spirit of the Enlightenment is characterized by the absolutization of human reason, which is now seen as autonomous and self-sufficient. This absolutization of reason runs parallel to various forms of skepticism toward organized religion. There were three main trends in Enlightenment thought: the critique of traditional theology, deism, and atheism. Now, biblical criticism, which is the critique of traditional theology, arose as one of the immediate and direct implications of modern rationalism. One of the founders of biblical criticism was, as it is well known, Baruch Spinoza, who was the last scriptural philosopher and who was one of the pioneers of modern rationalism. The primacy of reason, which the Enlightenment thinkers asserted and defended, was extended to the domain of revelation. Who are the deists? The deists are those people who believe in God, but who do not believe in specific revelation and who are not subscribing to any particular religion. So the deists, who belong to the second major trend of the Enlightenment thought, disposed of the very idea of revelation. Atheism, which was the third and most radical trend of the Enlightenment thought, and here I would also include agnosticism, which is a softer form of atheism. So atheism rejected the belief in God and for that reason denied the credibility of revelation and the authority of any scriptural texts, including the Bible. So what we see is this. Biblical critics, deists, and atheists, all for different reasons, were committed to questioning the scriptures, which constitutes the essential feature of the systemic crisis of religion, in this case Christianity. Having initiated the critical stage in the evolution of the Christian faith, Enlightenment ideology transformed it in the course of the 19th and 20th century into a global crisis of religious consciousness, a total crisis of religion. So the rise of the Soviet Union in the 20th century, as I understand it, was the manifestation of those radicalist Enlightenment tendencies, which negatively affected the three major world religions, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, that had peacefully coexisted in Russia for centuries. And the spread of totalitarian states all over the world in the same century also bore witness to the global crisis of religion. Now, the Enlightenment marks a watershed in the history of humanity. Religions should somehow reply to it, respond to it. And traditional religions, which were formed before the Enlightenment, have a limited number of ways to do that. Since their scriptural canons are fixed and cannot be altered to address new cultural developments, they can either accept or reject the social teachings of modernity. And that's what we see in different traditional religions. So the first case produces what I call the renewal of religion. When religion becomes liberalized, it emphasizes, in the case of Christianity, ecumenical dialogue, interfaith dialogue, and it accommodates modernity within its own ideology. In the second case, we witness the revival of religion. Religion becomes much more fundamentalist, nationalistically oriented, and regards modernity as its enemy. Now, those both approaches are easily seen in pretty much all religions. In Protestantism, liberal versus fundamentalist tradition. In Catholicism, the First Vatican Council of the 19th century versus the Second Vatican Council of the 20th century. In Islam, let's say Republican Turkey versus Islamic Revolution in Iran, etc. Now, religions that were born after the Enlightenment, I call them modern religions, cannot afford such a reaction because their prophets had the opportunity to address modern issues and to produce a divine alternative to the secular worldview. Modern religious systems were established after the Enlightenment, and they have the advantage of addressing modern political and social issues in their scriptural texts, thus erecting a new absolute foundation that supersedes modernity. So if we have a modern religion that did not react in a positive way to the ideology of the Enlightenment, then this religion in the long run will not get enough followers, because why should we believe in the new prophet if we have all prophets who basically said the same thing in terms of spirituality and ethics, but they said nothing about social and political issues, but nor did the modern prophets. Every religion has its own unique point of attraction, which functions as a spiritual magnet for believers. So you become a Christian because you believe in the unique status of Jesus as a divine mediator between humanity and divinity. You become a Buddhist because you believe in the enlightenment of Buddha and you want to experience the same thing. You become a Muslim because you believe in the progressive revelation and the Prophet Muhammad brings you the latest update from God. Now, what about modern religions? A modern religion won't be able to compete successfully with those traditional religions unless it produces its own point of attraction. And this point of attraction should go significantly beyond the claims of spiritual and moral reforms, which are already available in traditional religions. So as far as I know, the Baha'i Faith is the only modern religion that provides an alternative social and political vision that goes significantly beyond modernity. And therefore, the comprehensive table of religious cycles would look like this, where you have all three religions that we've studied. Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, different phases of those religions. So we have systemic reform when we have a new religion, and we have structural reform when we have different branches of those religions. And here in the 19th century, we have another systemic reform, which is the Baha'i Faith, which is the answer, religious answer, to the total crisis of religion that started since the Enlightenment. And it is very interesting that this response to the crisis comes right after the crisis, right after the 18th century. So now let me say some words about the comparison between modernity and the Baha'i teachings. In my book, I dedicate 2 chapters to that. So obviously I will not talk about much detail, but I will make some basic points. Now the first point, the first point is actually about culture and civilization. The word culture comes from the word cult. It originates, culture originates in religion, and it entails a set of beliefs that operate from within the individual. Civilization, as I understand it, consists of rules that regulate the external behavior of individuals in society. So culture and civilization are interrelated. And culture can produce various forms of civilization. For example, Christian culture produced ancient Roman civilization, medieval civilization, Renaissance civilization, modern civilization. So modernity itself represents a specific type of civilization that developed from Christian cultural roots, while the Baha'i Faith lays the foundation of its own distinct culture that may evolve in the future into a variety of different civilizations. So from this point of view, it is not quite fair to compare Baha'i Faith and Baha'i teachings with modernity, because we are comparing the roots of one culture with the fruits of another culture. But we have to take this into consideration, simply taking this into consideration. Now, in many of his writings, Baha'u'llah not only addresses the issues of modernity, but also makes them the turning point for his own religion. In the Book of Certitude, for example, he discusses the modern crisis of religion in light of his reinterpretations of apocalyptic passages from the Bible and the Quran. In a series of letters to the secular and religious leaders of the world, Baha'u'llah advances socio-political doctrines that in many ways are in tune with the social program of modernity. I'm not going to discuss specific examples, just one. In the Tablet of the World, Baha'u'llah proclaimed the Enlightenment principles of religious tolerance, freedom of expression, freedom of association, equal human rights. He wrote here that, I quote, "The unbelievers have set their minds on four things: the shedding of blood, the burning of books, the shunning of the followers of other religions, the extermination of other communities and groups." So, end quote. In the New Revelation, he points out, I quote again, "These four barriers have been demolished and transmuted into spiritual attributes," end quote. Baha'u'llah supported and reinforced in his writings the positive features of the Enlightenment while questioning what he perceived as the downside of this ideology. So he encourages scientific progress, but when it leads to the invention of destructive weaponry and militaristic pursuits, he obviously doesn't. Not when it leads to the invention of destructive weaponry and militaristic pursuits. He approves of the democratization of politics, but falls short of sanctioning revolution and organized dissent. He promotes interreligious dialogue, but at the same time predicts calamities that may result from the secularization of life. Now, let's compare also briefly modern ideology with the principles of Baha'i organization. Every religion has three elements that constitute the power of its system: the interpretation of sacred texts, the administration of legal matters, and the observance of prescribed rituals. As far as I know, the Baha'i Faith is the first sacred tradition that introduces the modern principle of separation or distribution of powers into the domain of religious affairs. Baha'i scriptures are the only sacred texts, as far as I know, that explicitly speak of the separation of interpretation, administration, and worship. One of the major differences between Enlightenment ideology and the Baha'i administrative order concerns the notion of infallibility. The Enlightenment worldview is based upon the belief in pure reason and the corresponding reliance on human rationality, which is by definition subject to error. In contrast to the Enlightenment, the Baha'i worldview is centered on the infallible truth of divine revelation, and so depends on the notion of infallibility. Baha'i teachings also diverge from modernity on the issue of organized dissent, which they prohibit in the structure and functioning of the administrative order. In traditional societies, the prohibition of opposition was often a sign of tyrannical government. There are three main checks in the Baha'i organizational system to prevent that from happening: the sanctity of elections, consultative procedures, and collective decision-making by the spiritual assemblies. These are intended to guard the Baha'i community from the misuse of authority. Now, about the separation of religion and state. While Baha'is believe in the separation of religion and state, they also envision some form of cooperation between their faith and the government in the distant future. For now, Baha'is are firmly separated from political affairs. Baha'is in the West are forbidden from getting involved in party politics. But the Baha'i teachings envisage the participation of the elected houses of justice in state governance in the future. In my opinion, such involvement would be best served if accompanied by mutual checks and balances on the part of both religion and state. So now, some conclusions. The most important conclusion of my analysis of religious evolution consists in the fact, I would say, but let me say in the assertion that we cannot fully understand the events of 20th century history, and especially the rise and fall of the Soviet Empire, without recourse to Baha'u'llah and Baha'i thought. So in this case, Auschwitz is just one side of the coin, and the Gulag is just another side of the coin. Both sides of the coin are expressing the same problem. And if we want to make sense of what was happening in the 20th century, we have to look at the Baha'i Faith and Baha'i thought. Overall, the Baha'i Faith represents a religious tradition that is neither anti-modern, doesn't want us to go back to the Middle Ages, nor simply modern, it does not want us to stay within the confines of the Enlightenment, or even postmodern, which is, in my view, simply part of modern ideology, but instead truly post-modern, in the sense that it regards the Enlightenment as a foothold for its own development that will eventually supersede it. Although some of the features of the Baha'i worldview may seem like a step backward from the project of the Enlightenment, a comprehensive comparison between the two demonstrates, I think, the progressive nature of the former over the latter. Baha'i doctrines display spiritual depth, which is lacking in the Enlightenment ideology, since the Enlightenment ideology relies purely on reason and external social reforms. As a result, Baha'i teachings reaffirm most of the Enlightenment principles in a different religious setting, thus making them more deeply rooted in the human psyche and consciousness. Furthermore, Baha'i teachings take into consideration the disproportionate development of various nations on the planet. And Baha'i teachings modify and adjust some of the Enlightenment principles to better fit the whole of humanity. Such a position with regard to modernity in general and the Enlightenment in particular gives the Baha'i Faith, in my view, a unique attraction and an advantage over both the older and the more recent religious movements. An advantage that, if properly understood and appreciated, would reveal its high long-term potential. So that is the end of my presentation, and here is my bibliography.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. There's really quite a lot for people to digest here, where you have a theory of religion, a theory of history, and a whole connection between the Baha'i Faith and modernity, and a connection between the Baha'i Faith and Enlightenment. It's really quite sweeping, and it's something that I think it'll take even anyone a time to digest. Well, let me see what we have in terms of comments. Excuse me.
Excuse me, Robert.
Yes.
Should I stop sharing my screen, or should I continue that?
We could
back
stop.
to the initial slide.
Yeah, let's do that. We could stop it, but then we might have to start it again if there's.
Okay.
I don't see any questions yet. So, perhaps if there's a way you could elaborate a little bit more on the points of the Enlightenment and some of the major principles of the Enlightenment, which you mentioned at the beginning. If you want to sort of talk a little bit about how those compare to the faith, and maybe you can bring out a little more depth about how the Baha'i Faith sort of does it one better, or whatever you want to say.
Look, the Enlightenment ideology is quite complex, and it was developed since the end of the 17th century and in the 18th century. if you look at the four basic ideas, reason, nature, liberty, and progress, you can see the overall Enlightenment worldview. So when it comes to reason, Enlightenment thinkers contrasted their understanding of human rationality with traditional understanding. When reason would support the revelation, revelation would be the most important source of acquiring knowledge. For Enlightenment thinkers, reason is the most important way of acquiring knowledge, where revelation comes second. When it comes to nature, let's say human nature, in Christianity, where the Enlightenment started, human nature was considered to be tainted by the original sin. So humans were not originally good. The Enlightenment thinkers proclaimed that human nature is at least potentially good. And the most popular Enlightenment idea about human nature comes from John Locke, tabula rasa, blank slate, so point zero. That was a theory that would fit well with the democratic political system. So no aristocracy. Everyone is born equal. When it comes to liberty, Enlightenment thinkers challenged traditional monarchy as the best way to organize society in politics, and proposed the idea of republican democracy. And finally, they believed that if we start thinking clearly, if we change our educational and political system, if we create a better political state and society, then we will enjoy infinite progress. Everyone will live happily ever after. So that is the overall picture of the Enlightenment. And even without referring to Baha'i Faith, we see that this picture does not hold because we did not live happily ever after in the 20th century. In fact, 20th century was the worst century in human history.
Yeah. Yeah.
Number one. Number two, the practical implications of this view is revolutions. So the first revolution that took place was the French Revolution. Actually, the first one was the American Revolution. Then the French Revolution. So the American Revolution reverberated in a series of 19th century revolutions for national independence in Latin America, for example. And the social revolution in French reverberated in other social revolutions, most importantly in the Russian Revolution. So what we see as a practical result of the Enlightenment worldview is basically a series of wars, revolutions, rise of totalitarian ideologies, millions of killed, etc., etc. Now, how does that relate theoretically to the Baha'i teachings? So number one, Baha'i teachings reverse back the dichotomy between reason and revelation. So revelation is more important than reason, and the arguments in this case would be that Baha'i revelation is written down, is well preserved, and cannot be questioned the way the Bible was questioned, because the Bible was written a long time ago.
Right.
So that is the first switch, and it is very important. When it comes to the human nature, Baha'i teaching on the human nature is much more complex than that of the Enlightenment and that of Christianity. Mm-hmm. So Abdul Baha distinguishes between the divine contribution to human nature, the cultural contribution, the inherited part of nature, and your personal contribution to what you do. So it is much more nuanced and can account for many things that are happening the wrong way, simply because you may inherit something that is wrong, or you may do the wrong choice. When it comes to liberty and to political organization, it is well known that Baha'u'llah praised the English Queen for establishing the parliament. Mm-hmm. So the idea that I think Baha'u'llah regarded constitutional monarchy is the most efficient, as the best to organize political system, because it accounts for the voice of various social strata. The aristocracy is there in the House of the Lords, and the commoners is there, and the queen or the king is there, who represent the divine decree or the divine will or the divine mandate. So I think here we have the emphasis on decentralization, on stopping tyrannies, and on giving more voice to the people. That goes along with the Enlightenment. Again, as I said, with some exceptions. Baha'u'llah does not incorporate the organized dissent into his religion for obvious reasons. And organized dissent goes against Baha'i principles. So that is different. I can talk about this for a long time.
Yeah, in fact, Ludmila says she has a few questions for you, but she hasn't written them down. So I thought I would take the chance to remind her that we can't easily be turning on people's microphones. In fact, we can't even see who people are frequently in terms of turning on microphones. So we do need to have people to write their questions down.
Just scroll down a little bit there, Rob. I think she did.
I don't see it yet. Oh, it is in Q&A. Maybe she found it.
I think I see something in Q&A.
Good. Those are brand new because I was checking Q&A and there wasn't anything there as of a minute ago. So yeah, here she is. Ludmila says, first, it is greatly appreciated to hear this talk. He did mention in his talk about the importance for a listener to study the Baha'i Faith. However, I would strongly suggest the listener to study history. In his example, he talked about Auschwitz and the Gulag. Well, ask many young students, many of them do not know both of these. They know one but not the other, and many might not know both. Is it possible to sign up to take his class? And there's no class specifically about this topic of the Gulag through the WOMED Institute, I'm afraid. I will share an anecdote about this topic of the Berlin Wall and of Auschwitz and the Gulag. I remember teaching exactly 30 years ago at the university when the Berlin Wall came down. And the next day, my students had no interest or sense of the importance of the fall of the Berlin Wall. I could not believe it. I mean, this was happening in their lives right at that time. So yes, this is a continuous problem that people do not really understand the implications of the events going on around them.
I may add that many young Russians nowadays, I'm watching Russian TV, many young Russians nowadays do not know who Lenin was.
Really?
Yeah.
I know they took his body out. I actually went to his tomb in Moscow in '92, and
it is still there. It is still there.
It's still there? Okay.
Yes, in the mausoleum. They do not know what to do with it because it is also a cemetery. All the great members of the Communist Party are buried there. Like in the Christian churches, you have the graves of the cardinals, etc.
Right.
Stalin is there. Yeah.
I didn't know that. I only remember noticing Lenin. Well, that's interesting. Anyway, Gary says, could you speak more about the idea of the Enlightenment and modernity providing a foothold for the Baha'i Faith? One might also see, or one might almost see that event/process/period as the necessary context, positing the absolute station of human reason as a reality to set the stage for a scientific consideration and understanding of the necessity of a spiritual or religious reality in human life. That's rather complicated phrasing. I'm not sure if I read it as easily as possible.
Well, I also opened Q&A, so I can read it. Let me answer the way I understand the question. First of all, my understanding of Baha'i Faith versus modernity begins with the idea that modernity really represents a landmark in the history not only of the Western world, but of the whole of humanity.
Yeah.
It not only started the crisis of Christianity, but it expanded to all other religions, and therefore, as a result, we are living in the total crisis of religious consciousness, which is described in the Bible as the apocalypse. You know, if what happened in the 20th century is not apocalyptic, what is? So therefore, new religious movements that start after the Enlightenment should address the Enlightenment itself. And I think this is the most pressing issue for Baha'i Faith to address the Enlightenment itself. I think that's what Shoghi Effendi meant when he was saying that the purpose of Baha'i scholarship is to make sense of the events that are happening now. You cannot understand the events that are happening now if you do not understand the basis of those events, which is modernity and the Enlightenment. And I think the Baha'i Faith is a religious response to the challenge of the Enlightenment, to the challenge of modernity. It is not only a response to traditional religions, because as Baha'u'llah said, in terms of spirituality, religions are teaching the same thing. But what is different here is the modern rational explanation of the way to live a life. And that's what produces secularization, because this is for the first time in human history since ancient Greece, humanity was able to come up with purely rational explanation for most of the problems of human existence. And as we know, this purely rational explanation will necessarily lead to terror, because human reason, no matter how powerful it is, cannot produce moral values.
Yeah.
From the fact that there is something, you cannot have a bridge to what you should do. From what you do, you cannot come to the conclusion of what you should do. When human ideology is based on the absolutization of human reason, the implications of that in centuries would be the deterioration of morality. And that is quite inevitable. And Baha'u'llah was well aware of that. And I think the most important point of comparison is that Baha'i Faith is trying to uphold some of the most important achievements of the Enlightenment. Human rights, freedom of expression, freedom to write your book, freedom to organize, freedom of association, the distribution of power, all those kind of things. Baha'u'llah wants to preserve them, but under a different banner. Because if they are preserved under a religious banner, they take a very deep root in human psyche. While if you take simply the Enlightenment ideology and transplant it to another country, instead of helping this country, you will actually destroy the culture of that country. And on the place of the culture, you will have a complete chaos. And that's what you get in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya. These are practical implications of trying to change human culture by means of purely rational instruments.
And presumably that's also true of Stalinism and Maoism.
Oh yeah. Yes, it is, and it produces horrible results. Millions of people killed for nothing.
Yeah. Well, Paul has a comment here too, which I'll read, even though you can read it as well, so our audience is familiar with it. Superb, Mikhail. However, you seem to speed up at the very end when sharing the distinctive answers of the Baha'i Faith to the classic developments of how religions evolve. Could you please show the last few slides again as you refer to the Baha'i Faith?
Yes, I was speeding up because I was looking at my watch and I see that the time is running out. That is true. But let me tell everyone that we have a PDF file with my presentation, and this PDF file would be available, and it has slide by slide with all the points. So you may revisit this.
Yeah, in fact, I don't know if we have it up yet, but we will have it up on the webpage about your talk. And of course, once the recording is available, we'll have a link for the recording also on our website, and people will be able to click on the description of the talk and the bio and everything at the top. They'll find the link to the recording and the video recording, and also a link to the PDF of the PowerPoint. You made the interesting comment that you saw post-modernity as a form of modernity. And of course, this is not my understanding of how it's usually understood. In many ways, modernity rejects some aspects of modernity, like, for example, issue of progress. So I was wondering if you would comment a bit about that and about postmodernity.
Yes, my pleasure.
Good.
Because this is the question that my students always ask me.
Good.
When I ask them, would you consider yourself a modern person or a postmodern person? And so here is my take on postmodernity. The basic idea of modernity is pure rationality. And I basically described the modern worldview. But postmodern thinkers, they think that they overcome modernity, but in fact, they make it more extreme. So here is what I mean. In modernity, in modern worldview, you still have the absolute. But instead of religion, this absolute is reason. So postmodernists get rid of reason as being the absolute. They reject all absolutes.
Right.
They do not introduce any alternative absolute. They reject all of them altogether. They reject the idea of truth with the capital T. They reject all the narratives, all grand narratives and great ideologies, and
presumably morality as well.
Yes,
capital
yes,
M.
yes, of course, because everything is relative.
Yeah.
But by doing this, they simply radicalize modernity, and religion in postmodernism is being reintroduced, not as a religion with the capital R, with the new revelation or revelation. Religion is being reintroduced as one of the language games, as one of the possible narratives that people can use along with magic, science, and whatever else they want to. Hence, religion in postmodernism serves a very different goal. And that's why a religion in postmodern times usually serves the goal of nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Back in 1993, I predicted that Orthodox Christianity will become, again, a national religion of Russia, and religious nationalism will be its guiding dominant ideology. And that's what is happening everywhere. When politicians move to the right, and when they move to the right, they take religion as their main instrument of supporting their views. But that is a very different use of religion, both from pre-modern times and in the Baha'i Faith.
Fascinating. That's fascinating. And that does explain the decline of morality even further. I see why you say it's really kind of species of modernity. That's very interesting. Well, Ludmila has written a little more. Ludmila Tsichotsky says, I was born in Odessa, Ukraine. I know the background of the speaker well. I was 16 when my family moved to the States. However, it is shocking to know that current generation does not know people who changed the lives of their ancestors.
Yeah, hello, Ludmila. It is shocking, but I watch not only Russian TV, but Voice of America and BBC and other outlets. And unfortunately, young people today in Russia do not care about history, Russian history, Soviet history. They care about their pockets. And people do not know who Lenin is. People know very little about their history. And I should say the same situation I find in the United States. My American students sometimes have, well, not sometimes, they do not know who Isaac Asimov is, the famous science fiction writer. They have no idea who Buster Keaton was. They barely know Charlie Chaplin, Not talking about European masters or European writers. Their tabula is very, very rasa.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one student out of 100 of mine, if I mention, maybe more than that, maybe 5% of my students, if I mention Martin Luther, they'll say, do you mean Martin Luther King?
Yeah.
They don't know who Martin Luther is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, there's no shortage of students of mine who will contrast Christians and Catholics as if Catholics weren't Christians.
Yeah.
That's another thing I encounter a lot in my classes. Ludmila goes on and asks, in your opinion, Mr. Sergeev, is Christian baptism part of the critical phase or post-critical phase?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think baptism as part of Protestantism is, of course, part of the critical phase. Post-critical phase are those Christianities that were born already after the Enlightenment, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses. And these are not Christianities from the point of view of classical Christianity,
Right.
because they reject the idea of the Trinity.
Right.
But they themselves see their religion as part of Christianity.
Right. I sometimes call some of those Third Testament Christianities because they add a separate text
Yeah.
to their canon in that sense. Though no one else in the world seems to use this phrase, Third Testament Christianity, but I find it useful. John says, great talk, well thought out. How can we speak to friends and others who seem to be caught up in the current resurgence of totalitarian thought, such as neoliberalism and white supremacy?
Well, these are different topics. Although I lived in the United States for 30 years, there are certain themes that I never discuss with my students. For example, I never discuss racism because racism is a serious problem in the United States, and I do not feel it the same way Americans do. I spent 5 years of my childhood in Africa. My first friends were Africans. I have almost intimate relations with Africa. And when I speak to Afro-Africans, I can immediately say that they are not Afro-Americans. Again, Americans have problems with slavery, with racism, with white supremacy, and this is very dangerous and horrifying to watch. But frankly, I do not know how to address that. As for neoliberalism, look, America is in deep, how shall I put it, deep hole of division. It is really amazing to see the hypocrisy of American politicians on all possible sides. They lost any sense of shame, really. And they are not ashamed of them being completely loyal to this person or to that party, even if the truth is obvious and it is very different from what they are saying. Whether it is neoliberalism or neoconservatism, etc., I do not know how to fight this. I think that American system is based on organized dissent. And organized dissent, unfortunately, presupposes this kind of division. You have to be loyal first to your party and then to your country. And that's how you become a politician. So that is the way things go.
And in a sense also, it's the postmodern aspect of our culture that truth is becoming so relative that you can't say, well, I'm sorry, that's fake news. Well, who says it's fake news? And in fact, with the balkanization of the media, Americans aren't all even getting the same news or even the same fake news for that matter. And what one group of people hear as news, other people hear as fake news and vice versa. And it means that consensus is almost impossible to build now in American society because people cannot agree on the facts. And unfortunately, go ahead.
So my personal answer to those questions is that every one of us has a personal place to fight this. I fight this in my classroom without being politically correct. I say what I think. So far, I was not fired. And we'll see what happens later.
Yeah. Well, I wonder whether this won't eventually lead to the kind of breakdown we see in some societies where people have private militias and areas are controlled sort of unofficially or even officially by groups with arms. You know, the country could very well end up getting divided that way, with people being kicked out of areas because they don't agree with the prevailing beliefs. We could see ourselves going in that direction. More and
Well,
more people,
hopefully not. Hopefully not.
yeah, with more and more people living in essentially gated communities, and every gated community being its own thing. I don't see any other. Well, maybe there's another question here. Actually, one just came in, I think. Oh, Lavilla says, "Stay that way," about not being fired.
Well, I'll try. I'll try. But unfortunately, from my Soviet days, I have a custom not to be silenced. So when I have to speak, I speak, whatever the consequences. So far, it was okay.
That's good. Well, we don't have anything new on the social media feeds because we have people, we avoid checking that for the Facebook. We have a lot of people on Facebook and on YouTube, of course, participating on this program as well. But we don't have any questions from them that I can see. I'm trying to think what else I wanted to ask you. The main thing I wanted to ask was about postmodernity, modernism. What direction, I mean, we went from modernism and the notion of science and progress and rationality, growing out of the Enlightenment, to postmodernity with this idea that you can't count on science and you can't count on progress and you can't count on truth. What's next?
Well, first of all, it is not about not counting on science. You can count on science within the domain of science. Science can resolve certain issues that are within its own domain.
Sure.
But then, there is no human enterprise that will be all-encompassing and will cover all domains. So you have a diversification of human endeavors. What's next? I personally think that postmodernism is already over, that the acme of postmodernism was at the end of the 19th century, and that the beginning of the end of the 20th century, and the beginning of the 21st century is now marked by another movement that is, I think, on the edge of Western culture, which is transhumanism. Usually what you have after total relativization is a new absolute. And transhumanism is about the new absolute. Yes, science, human immortality, the singularity, the merging of computer technology and human biology. That's what is the cutting edge.
And that's what you're going to be talking about later in about a year.
Yes.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Yes.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, well, I think we're pretty much finished here. I don't have any other questions from the audience, and I don't have any more myself. I want to thank you very much. This was a fascinating program.
Thank you.
Fascinating discussion, and I'm sure people will want to share this with their friends and have further discussion over coffee. So we're looking forward to the 2 talks you're putting together for us in 2020. And so to our audience, thank you everyone very much for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again with Michael Day in a couple of weeks, and then with Judy Moe Hannon after that when we talk about the Hannon family. And of course, with Michael Day, he's going to be giving us a history of the Shrine of the Bob and the construction of it and the moving of the remnants of the Bob to it and everything. So that should be quite fascinating. That will be our last presentation for the bicentenary. So again, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mikhail, for fascinating.
Thank you to everybody. Thank you for your questions.
And we look forward to seeing people again soon.